Yeah, today I'm going to talk about the economic history view of economic theory and economic policy. And I guess the most important question is, can history, economic history, can the history of development, of developed countries' development, inform us at all on what is good economic theory, and what is good economic policy in the present day? And it's obviously a large question, controversial subject, but I won't be able to do too much in 40 minutes, but at least give a flavor for what the debates are and what the conclusions might be. So let's begin about talking a little bit about the basic link between history and economics. And I guess we'd all agree, or at least economists would mostly agree, and some historians would agree, that economics should be somehow evidence-based. As a social science and pure science, we should look at the evidence. There's a difference between how historians look at it and the way economists look at it. And I think modern economics has been historically ahistorical, not historically, but in the present day is ahistorical, and deductive rather than inductive. The idea being that we take a model, we look at a model and we say, does this model fit with our perception of reality? But economics in the past, as you probably well know, was political at first. We get the mercantilists, we get political arithmetic in the mid-17th century. And it was, not only was it political, it was also inductive. So William Petty in the mid-1600s said, you know, let me count things. Let me use Mill's method of difference before Mills even got to the method of difference and say, what happened, how many ships does Holland have? How many ships does Britain have? How much land do people have? Who's making what commodities? What industry exists in both those two countries? And did a comparative analysis between Holland and Britain. But it turns out that Petty had no real interest in finding facts. It was a total political exercise because what he wanted to do was populate Ireland with English people and resettle Ireland as an English colony. So this idea of economics as a political instrument, I think some people would argue still exists to this day. And yet this idea of, well, even pure sciences can be socially and politically constructed, so why should the social science, where we have less pure science or less facts, less obvious conclusions to be induced from our models or deduced from our observations? And this is really important because what's accepted as truth drives present-day policy. So it turns out, of course, the debates, if you look in the press, that what we think happened in the Great Depression informs on the policy of what we should be doing to the global financial crisis. So what I've done today, what we're going to do today is, first of all, identify policies that governments have used in the past to influence economic growth. We're going to review I guess, the previously accepted history and the mainstream economists' view that free markets are associated with growth, industrial economic growth. What I then will do is narrate what I think is a more accurate history of, I guess, the history of industrial policy in developed countries. Argue that, and I guess conclude with, history doesn't support the idea that laissez-faire mainstream economic policies are associated with growth. And secondly, or more importantly, that aggressive government intervention in trade policy is associated with faster growth in developed countries throughout history. And if I have time, we'll talk a little bit about, is this evidence useful? Well, and I'll definitely talk about whether it's useful in analyzing economic theory, and hopefully talk about its usefulness in industrial policy in the present day. So, before, regardless of what mainstream economists think of government intervention, there has been in the past and continues to be a use by governments in use of current, what's called ITT, Industrial Trade and Technology Policies. And I'm going to talk mostly about the first two, maybe a little bit of time to talk about the third one. There's actually more than just these three. But the key ones are the industrial policies of government ownership, or co-ownership, or sponsorship of export businesses. We're going to talk, that could be direct or indirect supports. That could be an export subsidy, or just financial support of export industries. The second one is more trade policy focused, so talking about taxes on imports or tariffs, and non-tariff barriers, such as limiting amount of imports that are allowed into a country. And then finally, a little bit talk about intellectual property and technology policy, which deals with the licensing of technology to other countries. In the past, economics dealt with these factors. You get this idea in the mid-20th century of things called the Big Push or the Takeoff. And what we see here is the idea was the economies have to get to escape velocity. There's a coordination problem that you got a business that wants to export somewhere. What you need is, that business needs other businesses to support it. So the idea is you subsidize all these businesses at once, get over this so-called hurdle, this hump, and you get to critical mass and become a developed country. But it turns out, of course, that this is anathema to neoliberal, neoclassical economists and neoliberal economics. And to quote a famous neoclassical economist, Becker, the best industrial policy, according to them, according to economics, is none at all. Just a very quick slide on neoclassical economics. And basically the idea that besides the basic axioms of choice and maximizing utility, you get this idea that what we want to do, once we've made all these decisions, we want to create the least amount of frictions so we can facilitate exchange. We make each person better off. The idea of Pareto optimalities you're probably well familiar with. And so neoclassical economics focuses on how do we, given our initial endowments, how can we get this Pareto optimality? And of course it turns out that the idea is to keep as few market frictions as possible, the idea of laissez-faire. But we know that neoclassical economics is pretty, not let's say poor, but doesn't quite incorporate the production side of this equation very well, and doesn't deal with uncertainty too well. And we get the entrance, therefore, of Pigouvian ideas in 1920 and Keynesian ideas in the 1930s. You guys are here, so you have an advantage from that regard. And we get Pigou's idea that, well, not just his idea, but the idea of welfare economics. So this idea where we have market failure. So therefore, through all these processes, to get Pareto optimality, you at least have to think about a bunch of different factors other than just, is it the most optimal end position based on endowments? We have to think about, is it fair as well? And we have to compensate losers in this market, but with the surplus, the Pareto optimal surplus, I guess, or someone else's surplus, the gains from these trades. This comes through into the development economics of the period. So you get the World Bank and the IMF, well, the World Bank in particular, in the 1960s, 1970s under McNamara, you get this idea that, hey, this makes sense, right? That we should compensate, we should do this big push, we should do this, help countries reach escape velocity by supporting their industry, among other things. That gave way in the mid-'80s, or maybe in early '80s, I guess, to the Washington Consensus, a neoliberal idea, as identified by Williamson in 1980, that there are 10 policies that the IMF and the World Bank would then say, these are optimal strategies for economic growth. Nothing to do with the big push, nothing to do with helping, I guess, giving aid to help industrial policy, but more to do with making the markets more efficient, able to function properly. So this idea, I listed 3 here: privatization, trade liberalization, i.e. low tariffs among other things, and eliminating subsidies to export, well, anyone really, including consumer subsidies, but also to export-driven businesses. The idea here is, of course, to make the invisible hand work the best possible and reduce frictions. So the argument in favor of laissez-faire is that free trade good, government intervention bad. And we see that in the literature, talking about, even in history, saying the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, the tariff around 45, average 45% in the US in 1930, I can't remember the year, deepened the Great Depression. So what we should do is, again, reduce tariffs and therefore make possibly the exchange between countries more efficient. And then, more importantly, we have 2 arguments about government failure. The first, quite aggressive, the idea that public choice argument, again from the mid-'80s Chicago School, I think best made by Ann Krieger at the World Bank in around 1986, is the idea that governments are just as utility maximizing as individuals. So we get the idea of rent-seeking, where government, the elites run the government and they run all the industry, and they don't like change. They like it just the way it is, right? The elites are running these countries, both politically and economically. They don't really want to see new technology. It's not really in their interest to make their market more competitive and have wholesale change. The more benign argument about government failure is that, we get this idea of, the original idea of Plato's Republic, right? We get there's a philosopher king. Governments are unlikely, right? Very unlikely. A sort of skeptical view of mainstream economics is governments are unlikely to be omniscient and omnipotent, right? Efficient allocation of resources in an economy is difficult, and some would say that Soviet planned economies show that to be the case. So again, the neoclassical and neoliberal focuses on efficient exchange, and politics is seen to be blocking the operation of those markets. And the key phrase here is countries are poor because of too much government. And it turns out, you can see it in the literature, that history is said to be on the side of laissez-faire, which we'll see in a second. So there's an accepted view that there are three key myths of what you might call Anglo-Saxon and continental Europe development. And these influence the interpretation of historical facts. The first point, I guess, is that, or the first assertion is that Britain beat interventionist France economically after it abandoned the Corn Law in 1846 and after the free trade treaties of 1860. So it's only because of the sort of push towards free trade in that period that Britain was able to overtake France as an economic power. That's a ridiculous thought because we all know the Industrial Revolution happened way before that. But that's the first myth. The second myth is that that period from 1860 to 1879 is associated with economic dynamism on the continent. And it is true that there was a period of what you might call relative decline of Britain versus France during that period, of Britain during the Germany and France during this period. And maybe that's to do with the free trade, the focus on free trade on the continent during that period. And in fact, tariffs were quite low from about 1860 to just about the First World War. And the final point is that exact period, 1870 1914, is we get this new world economic order of low tariffs, low barriers to trade, and that caused unprecedented prosperity. We're obviously focused more, in the recency of economic history in a lot of cases, and we see, of course, that in the 1980s there is an association in literature between neoliberalism, so Washington Consensus, neoliberalism, and the sort of the prosperity of the 80s and early 90s, seen best exemplified by the miracle of Chile and the idea that the Chicago school liberalization of markets, institutions, of monetary policy, of fiscal policy, of financial institutions, caused a period of rapid growth and lessened impoverishment of the people in Chile during this period. So, what to make of that? Well, the accepted view is that what we need is that, what I said before, the Washington Consensus policy reforms, and these are requisite for economic growth. We have the International Institution of the World Trade Organization, previously GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs, GATT, Tariffs and Trade, not GAAT. The idea, again, that tariffs are anti-trade folly, so what we need is an organization that solves a collective action problem, that we're all going to end up with lower tariffs, fair trade, and everyone's going to be better off. The second issue is we should enforce patents. And the idea being there is that we're not going to innovate if we're not rewarded. So we should reward people for innovation. And the idea behind that is giving people global patents on intellectual property. That includes developed countries, such as, for example, John Hayden's in India. Then you have this idea of letting markets function. I mentioned before privatization, but that also includes market provision of public services. So basically get the government out of everything. And finally, I talked a little bit, it's worth talking about in public management. This is the idea that government administration, the economy, should be rational. It should be separate from politics. So we should say, we should give the power of the government to a third party, not third party, obviously, because it does report the democratic process to the politicians, but it's one step removed from the politicians. One step removed from politicians means one step closer to industry, and there's a whole literature on public choice in regulation, the capture theory, which means that basically, when that happens, government ministers end up acting on behalf of industry instead of on behalf of the people. That's a whole other story. There's a lot of pressure to conform to this, right? You've got the donor pressure of World Bank, IMF, and this post-Washington consensus, as it's now called, which is basically the Washington consensus again. And if you're interested in that, it then finds work on the subject at SOAS. And you get intellectual pressure. This idea that a lot of economists are educated in the same place, I don't have to tell you about that, and therefore we get this idea that this accepted view is the reality, and yeah, all sorts of pressures. And these pressures are almost overwhelming. But is it true? You know, first of all, is the first thing true? Is economic growth associated with free trade? In this case, I'm going to concentrate most on free trade today. And secondly, is if so, are these conditions for conditions precedent required conditions for economic growth? So first, I'd like to talk about the historical record in Britain. So we'll talk about Britain and the U.S. and a little bit on continental Europe. And it's going to be a bit hard to see. This is 1821 to 1911. This is the weighted average tariff in both countries. The orange line being France, and the blue line being Britain. So that's the first trope that we can basically ignore, which is that France was interventionist, at least on the tariff side, and Britain wasn't, because this is the last stage of the Industrial Revolution. Tariffs were really high in Britain, higher than 50% on a weighted average basis. The other thing is we actually do see that golden age of liberalism in trade, starting around 1866, funny enough, after the free agreement I was talking about between Britain and France. So we see that we 50% down to 30% at the end of the Industrial Revolution, then finally, after Britain asserted its dominance, economic dominance in this period, we finally see tariffs falling. And so the key takeaway here is that they are declining, that's for sure, but they're declining from a very high level. So that's sort of the quantitative side of it. So what happened before 1821, a little bit harder to determine on a graph, but fairly easy to see in the historical record. And it kind of all begins with Edward III, who was the first person first to identify with the idea of buying local. So he looked around and said, here's an idea, I'm going to support British manufacture, so I'm going to wear only British clothes. And he did things such as ban the import of woolen cloth. This carried on a little bit later with Henry VII, who aided local industry through subsidies, encouraged the businesses, poached skilled workers from low countries, so the idea of stealing intellectual property to some degree, banned and then later on we see after Henry VII, we see about 50 years later, banning of export of raw wool and unfinished cloth. But we really get to Britain's first Prime Minister, or under George I, where we really see trade policy in action. So you've got Robert Walpole, 1721 and beyond, who did all the things that neoclassical, neoliberal ideas, mainstream economics say we shouldn't do. So, some of them we should be doing, right? Lowering and dropping import duties on raw materials. So in the past we had duties as a revenue generator. This is the first idea that's really a bad idea, that we're going to have some benefit to dropping those duties. Duty drawbacks. So the duties that we do charge on imports, on raw materials, if you export them as a finished good, you'll get a credit, and that's where you get duty drawbacks. With export duties now set to zero, again, not thinking about those revenue generators anymore. With import duties, of course, classic tariff, import duties on finished goods were raised, and export subsidies, so subsidy of exported cloths, were given a bounty or a subsidy. Importantly, at the same time that import tariffs were so high in Britain, we also get the power of imperialism. We get the power, firstly, that tariffs of British goods to their colonies were zero. And secondly, we get this elimination of competition. So they get the policy that the Irish can't export wool in 1699, and we get the idea that Indians can't export calicos to Britain at all. And then we get even other interference, so the idea that Britain is saying we don't want to export our primary materials for building, for making things, so textile tools and utensils in this case. So we get an export ban on that. So that's, if you go back, that's sort of the UK experience qualitatively, UK experience quantitatively, and then we go move on to the United States. And the United States is a very interesting case because there's a huge intellectual propensity to tariff goods, to protect industry. And that begins, as Paul Bayrock said, we get the mother country and vastly modern protectionism in the United States. The highest tariffs, we'll see in a second, of all the countries that Bayrock studied. And we see the founding fathers talking about this infinite industry argument, the idea that we should, he recommended, Alexander Hamilton, 1791, he recommended that we should subsidize export businesses, and we should adopt the idea of a big push. So this is, what, 150 years, 170 years before the big push escape velocity concept was already a concept of the founding fathers. It also comes through in the North-South debates, just during the Civil War, with the idea of the tariff North versus the agricultural South, and there's a whole debate about how important was slavery to the Civil War, which I am not qualified to talk about, but it has definitely been mentioned that the Civil War is at least partially determined or partially caused by the debate about tariff or not to tariff. And in fact, in the 1900s, during my period of my PhD, we saw that same argument coming up, is the difference between industrial interests and agricultural interests. Adam Smith himself said that the U.S. should not just focus on agriculture. The competitive advantage of the United States is to grow things. So that's the founder of classical economics, or one of them, saying that maybe it's a bad idea to, even back then, to subsidize industry. And in fact, the U.S. does have the highest tariffs during this period. So again, we're looking at a different period because obviously U.S. economic history has a different time frame in terms of their biggest growth period. So about on here, 1800 to 1960. Again, we've got the U.S. against France. This is now average tariff, not weighted average tariff, but similar idea. And we can see the U.S. with the blue line is always above 40, except for a small period in the mid-20s, the Coolidge prosperity. But importantly, this is the Smoot-Hawley Tariff here, which was really not much higher than any other tariffs. The idea that somehow the Smoot-Hawley Tariff was the cause or deepen depression, well, it has to be a relative argument. It can't be an absolute argument. Or sorry, yeah, absolute relative argument, not absolute argument. And again, we see France much, much, much lower here. Again, the other important takeaway here is we see average tariff falling. But again, this is during a period, just like in the, just like we see here. Is this a coincidence? The tariff falls what, after the country achieves economic dominance? And this is going to be an important part of the argument, I think, coming up. So that was just tariffs we talked about. But there's actually a lot more industrial policy, even trade policy. In this case, we're talking more about just strictly trade policy than just tariffs, as we all know. You can do things like impose quotas, and you can, like I said before, subsidize industry. We talked a little bit about that. Export subsidies as well, and it turns out that's exactly what you identify in the historical literature as well. Non-tariff barriers probably as important as average tariff. And I've just got a couple examples in there. Germany in 1879. Though it is true that around this period we also get the idea, the intellectual idea, and the actual implementation of a free trade zone, Zollverein, I guess, around this period, free trade between the states. We actually have, and we have a low average tariff in Germany. So the argument is, well, hey, Germany was succeeding at this time, this golden, not golden age, but this this period, late 19th century period of expansion on the continent. So hey, that we kind of associate low tariffs with growth. The problem is that doesn't really work because some of the big businesses in Germany were highly tariffed. They were the highest tariff of all. But more importantly, there's more than just tariffs. There's lots of different industrial policies that were used by Germany. We've got state-sponsored industrial development and the encouragement of cartelization. So yeah, in neoclassical economics, we think cartelization is bad, and it probably is bad for the consumer in a lot of cases, and we can talk about, where does the consumer fit in my whole discussion here about industrial policy. It's not clear where. But the fact remains is that these are strategies that were practiced in the past, encouraging economies of scale within a country so it can be competitive outside that country. Sweden as well, history of public-private partnerships. So again, maybe not state ownership, but certainly a partnership which continues to some degree to this day. Something I didn't discuss here at all, but I'm about to, is both Sweden and Switzerland were encouraging, the governments were encouraging at the time, basically theft of technology. So in Sweden we get encouragement of espionage during this period, 19th century Sweden. And Switzerland, interestingly enough, even though we have this push for intellectual property law in the mid-1800s, to the late 19th century, Switzerland had no patent law at all. And there's an argument in the literature that this caused the theft of German technology in chemicals and pharmaceuticals in this period. Borrowing of technology, if you like. And it turns out, of course, that if you look at the Fortune 500 companies today, if you don't count banks and holding companies like Alliance Boots, actually you have to also include, to discount trading companies such as Glencore. How much business is actually done in Switzerland, I'm not really sure. But the biggest companies are drugs and chemicals. Again, I'm not trying to say causality here, but it's a correlation. The biggest businesses in Switzerland to this day are chemicals and pharmaceuticals. During this period, where Switzerland didn't have any law on intellectual property until 1907, it was very common, it's not well known, well understood, that intellectual property protection was only given to domestic companies. So, just for example, I've used in the US until 1891, foreign patents had no protection of any kind. So it was one thing to invent the light bulb, this is late after this, but it's one thing to invent something, it's another thing to be able to perfect your rights to intellectual property, and that was not enforced pretty much in any country during this period. So that's the point here of average tariffs falling after dominance, or during dominance at the very least, same here. This has led to what is now a popular conclusion, at least at Cambridge and certainly in the popular press, if not in economics profession, that both Great Britain and the US not only used industrial policies when it made sense to, but then went to free trade, consciously knowing that they were practicing free trade imperialism during this period. The idea that Britain in the 19th century, the corn law, obviously, which is a tax on import tax on corn. Well, corn is in this case, as you probably know, is all grains during this period. And the trade treaty with France, these were conscious decisions, including saying colonial tariffs at zero. Others just the Navigation Act of 1651, which basically limited any trade in the UK, in Britain, to being done on British ships with British crews. All these protectionist acts and the elimination of the tariffs, or reduction of tariffs during this period, was entirely a conscious decision. And you can see that in Pitt the Elder's comment here, which would that be 1750s, I guess, sometime in the 1750s, that colonies should not be permitted to manufacture so much as a horseshoe nail. This is a conscious decision to drop tariffs during this period. We see that also in the US. So we see, again, as I showed you on the graph, that we see tariffs falling off in the mid-20th century. And why do we see? Well, even though we keep up there are lots of non-tariff barriers happening in this period. So it's not as if tariffs are dropping, therefore trade barriers are dropping. I mean, they are to some extent, but there are lots of other ones to this day that are being used, which we can talk about if we have time, which I'm sure we won't. Which leads us to Frederick Leist's comment in 1885, which I think, is based on Hajun Chang's book, or as the title is at least Kicking Away the Ladder. And we see that even back in the late 19th century, there was a realization that the US and Britain and other countries were using trade policy as a competitive advantage, or I should say a lack of trade policy, or the lowering of tariffs. And I love this. There's a realization that any nation who's raised their manufacturing power and navigation, which again was important in this period. I would also argue that finance was important, and markets for insurance and risk were also important in this period, can do no better than throw away these ladders of greatness, the idea that we should make everyone else drop their tariff barriers, and to preach to other nations the benefits of free trade, and to declare in penitent tones the paths of our error. Sounds a lot like today, I would say, to some degree. So we might say, okay, well, we've got some qualitative evidence. I'm not sure how good some of this qualitative evidence is. I mean, we all know from history that there are weaknesses with data sets. And for example, in Edward VII's case, that comes from Defoe, the person who wrote Robinson Crusoe, a great piece of fiction. So how true the story about Henry VII having an intellectual propensity to industrial policy may, how accurate that actually is, we're not, we can't be sure. We have some more, recent examples. With Japan in the middle of the century, unequal growth, subsidizing industries, including shipbuilding, protecting infant industries. We have the same thing in the Asian tigers. And what's important here is it wasn't until the World Bank wrote this paper in 1991, which I have the citations and the references, that everyone really realized that this success is associated with the same policies. Export push strategy, promoting specific exporting industries. And this was viewed skeptically by the rest of the community. And why should Korea have a steel industry? What possible advantage should Korea have in the steel industry? I mean, Belgium, there's lots of coking coal and things like that. We understand the steel industry, but why Korea? So, not much time. So just quickly talk about, well, does that mean that tariffs cause growth? We have an association. I think I've shown it again. It's not my secret argument. It's in Chang's book, Kicking Away the Ladder, that industrial policy worked. It's associated with growth rather than laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is hard to find in the historical record, at least during the periods we're talking about here. Lots of problems on why that might not be a good idea. History is contextual. What causes what? We don't have any, it's not natural, it's not an experiment. Never mind, natural experiment. It's not an experiment at all. So there's lots of, we could have any number of explanations for why growth happened or why growth didn't happen. You could say, well, France had low tariffs, therefore it had problems, it had economic stagnation, but it could just be because there were a lot of rent seekers and it was a corrupt economy. We get lots of explanations. But I think the best example, or one of the best explanations, is international political economy. And this is my reasonably stolen slide, intellectual property theft. Free trade burning, and is it the average person who's causing free trade to burn, to prevent laissez-faire? But no, it's U.S. agribusinesses, it's European farmers, and it's not at all the average person. And it turns out the WTO is strongly biased against developing countries, and just some examples of that in the literature. Let's see if I can find a couple of good ones. So, I mean, a great example, Robert Waite, the LSE, has done some really good work on this in more recent times. And he's got this idea that the World Trade Organization rules, they're supposedly anti-tariff, laissez-faire rules, are in practice work against developing countries. They're vague, his exact words are, they're vague where vagueness benefits developed countries and precise at points where precision works against developing countries. Export subsidies are expressly forbidden, except among the very poorest countries. And importantly, many policies are expensive, right? Subsidization is a really expensive policy. You probably have to rely on external financing for that. That might be hard to get if you're not following the neoliberal policy prescriptions. And again, Wade goes through this, Robert Wade, the idea that fighting WTO is expensive. There are lots of examples of, a developing country trying to get favorable terms, or at least trying to, and not succeeding. One argument is that's a resource problem. And finally, we talk about the WTO's IPR, intellectual property rights rules, that are very strict on how technology can be used without paying for it. So, what can we conclude? Well, we can definitely conclude that there has been industrial policy, right? Industrial policy has been used, so that's pretty clear. But of course, is correlation causation? And even if they worked, there's a good argument, a lot of good arguments, some bad ones, unfortunately, why they might not work anymore. It was contextual. Maybe it wasn't just tariffs, maybe it was transportation costs. Transportation costs to the New World were higher than the tariffs. So even if you just had zero tariffs during 1800s, early 1800s, you would definitely have some sort of trade barriers anyway. And finally, we have that cynical argument, skeptical argument of mainstream economics, which is, can the state have winners, or does it just create losers? A good example of that might be, I see in Canada, my home country, that we just keep subsidizing the same businesses over and over, and they keep losing money. Is that a good industrial policy or a bad industrial policy? Just because it has a few jobs, and the elite, political elites like those businesses, which is the one being Bombardier, the plane company, why exactly Canada should be making planes? Not clear. But I think what I'm trying to get at here is, at the very least, we should see that laissez-faire is generally not associated with the periods of growth that we talk about. We talk about industrial revolution. We talk about the rise of dominance of the U.S. It's not clear at all that there's anything to do with laissez-faire. Finally, it's also clear that in the present day, as I said before, intellectual political economy, that there is a politics of economics at work. There was then, right? The power of Britain to impose zero tariffs on their own products and to have high tariffs against France is at least partially to do, according to some arguments made recently by O'Rourke and Williamson, to do partially because of their physical power, their political power, to force these things in other countries. And this today, well, it can still be done to some degree, but it's a lot harder. And so, as we probably all know, neoclassical economics doesn't handle market intervention very well. It doesn't handle problems of production very well. So maybe there is room for historical evidence in both thinking about economic policy and economic theory. Thanks.
Okay, nice. So we got still 10 minutes or so for questions. If anyone has any points to clarify or anything like that. Here we go.
Thank you for the talk. My question, can I have actually two questions?
I suppose that's okay.
So one thing I wanted to ask about, or maybe clarify, is that have you seen the term Big Push being used by Alexander Hamilton or the later theories before the Second World War? Because as far as I know, there's a Big Push theory which is associated with it's a bit different than actually the paper that kind of started it, was arguing against industrial policy in the country and for a regional industrial policy. So was it your use of the term, or was it there in the literature actually?
So that's a good question. That's a very good question because it's actually more complicated than that, I think, in the history. Because even the idea behind the Big Push, not those exact words, one of the main components of it was using it as a political economic tool. Right? The idea was that the U.S. should subsidize countries that don't become part of the CIS, or become Sovietized, or become communist. So it wasn't really about domestic government policy at all. It was about foreign government policy, about foreign subsidizing. So again, you're absolutely right. It's not that word's not used in a lot of these cases, it's just an analogy.
Yeah, and the second question, do you actually, because at the beginning you were also talking about some of the earlier economists, and I just wanted to ask whether you by any chance are acquainted with the literature for the historical school, which was dominant at the kind of 100 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know much about, but maybe you could recommend some readings or just outline it briefly there.
So I can recommend some readings for sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, it is an important part. I couldn't really talk too much about the infinite number of economic schools at the time. We've forgotten a lot about it, I think. That's worth, and Gershon-Kron, all this stuff is worth reconsidering to some degree. But again, it's hard just to take too much about that.
Okay.
It's got some relevance, but I guess it's been mostly ignored lately. So it'd be nice to not bring it back, and some people have to some degree, but probably not enough.
Okay.
I think isn't there a paper here on that talks a lot about the different schools of economic thought?
What, to what you
Undergraduate.
back into?
Yeah, I'm sure there is.
Maybe one of the Chang ones.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So he's this year, right? He's doing it.
Oh yeah, history and philosophy of economics.
Right, exactly. So there's a whole section on different schools and on that, which is nice.
Great, thanks.
Any more questions? Any development studies students who are skeptical of Hajin Chang or? Yes, you have to actually go to his lecture right now.
I'm reasonably skeptical myself, actually, in some parts, for sure. In fact, the reason why I did this work is because it was a paper I wrote for him.
So yes, any more questions? Okay, that's it.
Thanks.
All right, let's give